quite correspondingly, one might study the visual system, let's say, as was done for a very long period, knowing, say, nothing about how it's physically, how the principles that we are led to attribute to this system, the, let's say, analyzing mechanisms that we are led to attribute to this system, knowing nothing about how these may be physically realized in our neural structures. And I think it's quite appropriate to think of the contemporary study of language as being analogous to a study of vision at a period when it's remained impossible, technically, or through the limitations of understanding technique and so on. It was impossible to determine the actual physical elements that entered into these systems, which could be studied only in an abstract fashion.
There seems to be a special difficulty here. I mean, we accept the fact that I can't, by introspection, however hard I try, observe the workings of my own liver. I can't observe it in the act of secreting bile or whatever it does. And similarly, presumably, I can't observe these language formation faculties of mine at work. But nevertheless, there is an important difference, because if we want to investigate the workings of the liver, we can observe other peoples. I mean, you can bits of live peoples, or the whole of dead peoples, or animals' livers. You can experiment with different inputs and see what difference they make to the output, and so on and so forth. But we can't do that with animals as far as their language-using faculty is concerned, because they haven't got language-using faculties. Now, doesn't that shut off from us what is in fact the chief mode of investigation with all the other biological faculties that we have?
It does very definitely stop a very natural mode of investigation. That is, we are not, for ethical reasons, we do not conduct intrusive experiments with human beings. So, for example, there are very natural modes of investigation that suggest themselves at once. Suppose, for example, I propose that language has some general property, and that every human language must have this property as a matter of biological necessity. If we were dealing with a defenseless organism that we were allowed to study, say, the way we study monkeys or cats, what we would do is employ the method of concomitant variation. That is, that we would design an artificial environment, let's say, in which this principle was violated, and ask whether the system develops in a normal way under those conditions, for example, to take one case. Well, that we can't do in the case of humans. We can't design artificial contrived environments and see what happens to an infant in them, just as we don't conduct ablation experiments with humans. And it's important to recognize that this limitation raises no philosophical issue. What it means is that we have to be cleverer in the kind of work we do, because a number of modes of inquiry are simply excluded, there being, as far as we know, nothing analogous to the language faculty in the case of other organisms. But that doesn't mean that we can't study the problem. We have to study it more indirectly. We often can't directly move to the experiments that would give us clear and precise answers to questions that we raise. But if you think about the model that I put forth, that is, that the model of an organ beginning in a genetically determined initial state and growing to a mature state of knowledge, then it's obvious that that mature state of knowledge will be determined by two factors. One, the initial genetic endowment, and secondly, the impinging experience. So as far as the final state of knowledge is concerned, what's called the grammar of the language, the system of rules and principles that determines what is a sentence and what it means and how it sounds and so on, as far as that system is concerned, we really can get tremendous amounts of evidence. In fact, every utterance that's produced is an experiment, if you like. Every reaction of a person to an utterance is an experiment. So there's no shortage of information concerning the mature state of knowledge achieved. If we can then discern in the mature state of knowledge principles and properties which are in no way presented in the experience that is available, it's very plausible to propose those as properties attributable to the initial state.
The main thing I want to do in this discussion, Professor Chomsky, is go into the implications of your work for philosophy. I don't want to pursue you into the nature of the work itself, because that's highly technical, obviously, and it's not really feasible to discuss it in a television program of this kind. Let us now, as it were, assume the truth of your theories and start looking at the wider implications of them, because this, I'm sure, is what will interest our audience most. One consequence of your theories is that we are, as human beings, very, very rigidly pre-programmed. There are certain things we can understand, certain things we can communicate, and anything that falls outside that, we simply can't. Is that so?
That's certainly correct.
So, I mean, in a way, this is a rather alarming doctrine. I mean, it certainly contravenes the way we want to feel about ourselves.
Well, that may be an immediate reaction, but I think it's not the correct reaction. In fact, while it's true that our genetic program rigidly constrains us, I think the more important point is that the existence of that rigid constraint is what provides the basis for our freedom and creativity. And the reason...
What you mean, it's only because we're pre-programmed that we can do all the things we can do.
Exactly. The point is that if we really were plastic organisms without an extensive pre-programming, then the state that our mind achieves would in fact be a reflection of the environment, which means it would be extraordinarily impoverished. Fortunately for us, we're rigidly pre-programmed with extremely rich systems that are part of our biological endowment. Correspondingly, a small amount of rather degenerate experience allows a kind of a great leap into a rich cognitive system, essentially uniform in a community, and in fact roughly uniform for the species.
Which would have developed over countless evolutionary ages through the biological
system,
evolutionary process.
Right. The basic system itself developed over long periods of evolutionary development. We don't know how, really. But for the individual, it's present. As a result, the individual is capable of, with a very small amount of evidence, of constructing an extremely rich system, which allows him to act in the free and creative fashion, which in fact is normal for humans. We can say anything that we want over an infinite range. Other people will understand us, though they've heard nothing like that before. We're able to do that precisely because of that rigid programming. But short of that, we would not be able to at all.
What account are you able to give of creativity? If we are pre-programmed in the way you say, then how is creativity a possibility for us?
Well, here I think one has to be fairly careful. I think we can say a good deal about the nature of the system that is acquired, the state of knowledge that is attained. We can say a fair amount about the biological, the basis in the initial state of the mind for the acquisition of this system. But when we turn to a third question, namely, how is this system used? How are we able to act creatively? How can we decide to say things that are new but not random, that are appropriate to occasions but not under the control of stimuli? When we ask these questions, we really enter into a realm of mystery where human science, at least so far, and maybe in principle, does not reach. We can say a fair amount about the principles that make it possible for us to behave in our normal creative fashion, but as soon as questions of will or decision or reason or choice of action, when those questions arise, human science is at a loss. It has nothing to say about them as far as I can see. These questions remain in the obscurity that in which they were in classical antiquity.
Would you also accept this, or not, that having arrived at our present situation across millions of years of evolution, we must have been going through a continual process of innovation and new adaptation and development of new abilities, dispositions, organs, etc. Might we not still be, as it were, plastic at the edges? Might we not still be developing and changing and genuinely evolving, if only on the margin?
Well, I think one has to be, again, very cautious here, because while it's true in a very vague sense to say, it's correct to say that the systems that we now have developed through evolution, through natural selection. It's important to recognize how little we are saying when we say that. For example, it is certainly not necessarily the case that every particular trait that we have is the result of specific selection. That is, that we were selected for having that trait.